What makes the RSPB so successful at influencing the direction of farming?
Well, the first thing I should say is we're very flattered. It's nice to come out top in your poll. I suppose I'd pick out three things really. I mean, the first thing is that we have some empathy with the farming community. The RSPB itself has a large estate, over 200 nature reserves, but about 70 of them are dependent on farming practices. So about 20,000 hectares are dependent on essentially, well-managed farming systems. But at the same time, we own and manage our own commercial farms. So I think we do understand some of the pressures, not all of them, some of the pressures that the farming community faces. But I think I'd add a couple of other things to that. I mean, one of the other things is that we are passionate about wildlife, and 70% of the nation's land is farmed. And if we want wildlife to recover, then of course it needs to be harmonious coexistence between the land manager and wildlife. And that, in a sense, I think is where our drive comes from, which is why we're persistent, which is why we look for creative solutions. And the third thing I'd say is I think we're science-based. We do genuinely invest in understanding what's happening to the countryside, why things are going down, if they're going down, trying to do something about it, coming up with the right solutions which we think will work for the farmer. So a mixture of empathy, passion and a degree of evidence-based policy making.
Some farmers would say that you are anti-farming, but I take it that you see yourself as being more of a critical friend of the industry. How do you respond to that?
I think many people will have judgments about the RSPB and our engagement with farming. I hope that we would come across as a constructive friend. We do work with a large number of farmers up and down the countryside. We have a team of advisors who are walking down the farm gate, talking to 3,000 farmers to try and encourage them to do more for their land, for wildlife. And I hope that they see them as working, see us as working in partnership with them. I think also, obviously, we are committed to trying to ensure that farm and wildlife recovers. And we will do whatever it takes to help nature recover, do whatever nature needs. And in a sense, that runs through the whole of our strategy.
Do you think that you know best when it comes to the future of farming, or do you think farmers know best?
Absolutely not. I mean, I think that there are conflicts between farming and wildlife, and I think what we've found over certainly the last 20 years or so, is that many farmers are coming up with all sorts of solutions about how you reconcile the tension between production, agriculture, and an attractive countryside rich in wildlife. And I think many of the solutions which are out there have come from great farming practices, and we like to celebrate great farmers. We have our own Nature of Farming Awards where we celebrate the best of the farming community who deliver good commercial farming practices while at the same time helping wildlife along, and I think that's great. So yeah, we want to be a constructive friend.
And do you have a more conciliatory approach towards farming than perhaps your predecessor, Mark Avery, who I guess he would say he said things that needed to be said to farmers in being a little bit more critical of agricultural policy. But what can we see from your point of view over the next few years when it comes to farming and the RSPB?
Well, I think I should say, Mark did some fantastic things in terms of his time at the RSPB. He was my boss for 7 or 8 years. I'm a fan of Mark's, but I think at times the tone and style of Advocacy meant we got a bit distracted from some of the bigger issues, and I don't really want to comment too much on that. I mean, my own personal approach is I want to work with the most progressive farmers in the industry to try and come up with some answers to an incredibly important question which DEFRA itself has posed, which is how do we increase production in this country whilst at the same time enhancing the natural environment? That's the right question to ask, and I'm very glad that DEFRA has invited the likes of the RSPB and DEFRA and CLA and NFU to come round the table to try and come up with answers to that question.
And what works best in terms of lobbying? Is it direct action or more softly approach? How do you go about it?
Well, I mean, my own personal view about these things is, how can we make the things that we want happen politically desirable for decision makers? How can they get credit for it? Or the other approach is, how do we make them feel the pain if they don't act? So we're lucky enough to have over 1 million members. They all vote. In fact, we know they all like voting. About 96% of RSP members generally vote. So if we can try and encourage them to express their view through their constituency MPs, that can have pressure. But I think what decision makers want is they want answers to some of these complicated problems, and we're in the business of trying to come up with solutions to how you can manage your land with wildlife in mind.
One of the big successes in recent years with the RSPB has been in that you were instrumental, I guess, in persuading the last government of the necessity of retaining the environmental benefits of set-aside, and that prompted the farming industry to set up the Campaign for the Farmed Environment. If it wasn't, in other words, for the RSPB pushing for those measures, that campaign wouldn't exist. It's due to be reviewed next year. Do you see it as being a success, or does it need to continue?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is that there were consequences for wildlife with the removal of set-aside. And I think what was great, it was a recognition that we needed to do something to try and replace the good things about set-aside for wildlife which were lost when it was abandoned. I think DEFRA was right in suggesting that June next year, I believe, that we should review whether Campaign for Farmed Environment has been successful. And if not, I think they've used the phrase they'll explore whether other approaches will be necessary. I'm hopeful that we can deliver those wildlife benefits through the voluntary approach, but I think it's up for government, obviously, to decide what to do if that's not successful.
Do you believe that the farmland bird index truly reflects the state of farmland bird populations and the wider rural environment?
Well, there's two things I'd say about it. I think it's probably the best that we've got. I mean, it was the birds that were identified, the 19 birds, mixture of generalist birds and specialist species such as tree sparrow, skylark and lapwing. I think they were identified with the spirit of trying to come up with an indication of what's happening to wildlife in the farm landscape. And actually, since that index has been generated, and obviously that's shown the fact that over 40 to 50 years the farmland bird index has halved. But I think what we've also had over the last 15 years is a similar index for butterflies, and we've begun to pick up some trends about what's happening to farmland butterflies, and unfortunately they are declining as well. So I think in a sense, rather than debating about the relative merits of the indicators, I think we should respect what the indicators are telling us, and then say, so what are we going to do about it? And I think many farmers want to try and come up with the right answers, and we're in a business of coming up with the right answers and hopefully influencing DEFRA to design appropriate agri-environment schemes which benefit farmers and wildlife.
And finally, CAP reform. I think you're on record as saying that as they stand, the proposals would be bad for wildlife and bad for farming. Can you expand a little bit on that and say what you would prefer those proposals to encompass?
I think we are pretty disappointed with the proposals that have emerged. I think our view is that well-designed, well-resourced, targeted agri-environment schemes deliver for wildlife. And I think what's happened over the last 10 to 15 years or so is that farmers have restructured their businesses so that essentially they can access and benefit from some of these schemes. I think we're getting mixed messages coming out of Brussels at the moment. We're relieved by the defence of some elements of the so-called Pillar 2 payments, which will ring-fence some money for agri-environment schemes, but we think it's not going far enough. And so we will continue to work over the next couple of years to try and make sure that CAP does actually deliver for farmers and wildlife.